The big cats and other big carnivores have been important to humans since recorded history. Some were a direct threat. They killed us. Some were quite economically important. They ate our domestic livestock, and they killed desirable wild animals like deer that we wanted. And culturally, they've been a part of written history. They've been inspirational, and they're part of mythology for centuries. The great Eastern Asian cultures lean heavily on tigers in their mythology and their art. They've been used as symbols of strength and courage by kings, by emperors, by leaders for recorded history. At the same time, throughout history, we've tried to exterminate them, and we've done a pretty good job of it. Only in parks and reserves worldwide have many of these big carnivores, the bears, the wolves, the big cats, have they survived. Here in North America, we exterminated them over most of the landscape. We were a rural society. We were settled by Europeans, and we're largely a rural society for the first 2 centuries. And so we exterminated wolves completely from the 48 states. Mountain lions hung on only in very remote habitats, and the grizzlies survived only in parks and some of the wilderness areas in the northern Rockies. The black bear behaves a bit different, and it persisted much better. But beginning in the last half of the 20th century, attitudes begin to change. Our society is going more from a rural agrarian society to an urban society. And urban populations place a lot more value on all wildlife species. So in a cultural sense, people in an urban society place high value on the big carnivores, just the knowledge that they exist. And such noble and beautiful specimens are conserved and still exist. And in a scientific sense, we've become aware of the importance ecologically of the big carnivores. They are at the apex of the food chain, and thus they really define an entire system, entire ecosystems. They range so widely and so big that they can define that entire system. They eat the plant-eating species, deer, the herbivores, and those animals in turn eat the vegetation. If you have healthy populations of big carnivores, it stands to reason you have healthy populations of all those animals that support them and the environment that supports those prey species. And along with that are attendant other species, all the birds and lesser mammals. So there's been renewed interest in the big carnivores. Wolves have been reintroduced in the northern Rockies, and they're thriving in Yellowstone and in the central Idaho wilderness. Grizzlies are protected for the most part, and we're considering reintroducing them into some of their former range. Black bears are thriving over much of the range throughout the contiguous 48 states, and mountain lions are thriving in the western United States. The mountain lion is probably the real success story worldwide for big carnivores. Without a great deal of fanfare, without a great deal of special commissions or acts of Congress or whatever, they've come back dramatically throughout the West. And in fact, we may have more mountain lions in some regions of the West than we've ever had. And with that comes responsibility. Success of any of these programs dictates a management responsibility. With high carnivore populations, higher numbers of people, human populations, comes a greater possibility of contact between the two. Agencies, governments should be aware of that and should be ready to deal with those situations with full knowledge and consent of the public.
How wide or large is the market for tiger products, and what are you doing to combat that?
The market extended throughout much of Eastern Asia. But the big market now, from all reports, is in China. The Japanese have pretty much quit buying hides as trophies, and reports are that they just aren't really interested in continuing this use of medicinal products. The same is true in Korea. But China is still what most people regard as the problem. And beyond what I've told you earlier, beyond the big program the WCS is launching, World Wildlife Fund, other organizations are also involved in educating, bringing information to the younger generations in China and Eastern Asian countries as well, to discourage the use of these products. These are century-old beliefs that don't go away quickly. And so we must work with the children and the younger generation. And that's what this big program is designed to do, to target the youngsters, the children. There are alternatives. And of course, the one that first comes to mind, Prince Philip said the Chinese don't need aphrodisiacs. And of course, Viagra is the first one to come to mind. But whether they would buy that or not, we don't know. But humor aside, it is still a serious problem, and one that we certainly are addressing.
You mentioned, I think, 450 tigers in the Siberian forest, the area in which you're studying. What about genetic diversity? When you get to such a small population, how critical is genetic diversity?
That isn't so important with some geneticists. There's a bit of controversy there. It isn't so important with some geneticists now as it once was. And those individuals will point to whooping cranes that got down to 10 or 12 birds. And they point out that any individual that isn't genetically viable or healthy is quickly weeded out in nature. If it's behaviorally deficient or if it's physically deficient, it just doesn't last. And so those millions of genes that mix up, sure, it's great to have all the genetic diversity we can, but when it means survival or extinction, then we opt for survival. We aren't too concerned about the Siberian tiger. We were down at one point to perhaps 200 individuals, but we see nothing that would indicate that they're lacking in vitality or adaptiveness or any of the things that makes the great tiger what it is. There's an international tiger stud book that's kept in England and Europe, and there are American representatives on that. And this is very carefully kept, because many of the Siberian tigers in captivity, and there are more in captivity than there are in the wild, are of unknown genetic origin. So only those of known Siberian tiger offspring of known Siberian tigers are kept in that book. It's very carefully kept. And that's about all I can say about that. They were eager to enroll these individuals that we brought from Siberia because they were definitely right from the source.
Do the tigers that are bred in captivity ever go back into the wild?
No one has attempted to place them back in the wild yet. There is talk of captive breeding programs with the aim, like we have in Florida with the Florida panther, of placing offspring eventually back in the wild. There's a debate now among the Russian scientists whether we should take some of the most endangered big cat of all, the Amur leopard, which occurs only in a small area on the North Korean, Chinese, Russian border, whether we should take some from the wild into a captive breeding program. Some want to do that, some don't, feel that we should work toward enhancing the habitat before we take any valuable animals from the wild. In answer to your question, no, there hasn't been any tigers placed back in the wild. We hope, and we have every reason to believe, that this conservation plan that we've crafted, that has been accepted by the Russians, will do that. We believe that build it, and they will come. We're working with authorities to promote sustainable forestry practices, and you'll see some of the practices that came about after the fall of the communist government, massive clear cuts, which really weren't conducive to prey species, to tigers. The Russians have pretty well stopped that. We don't say don't cut the forest, but cut it in the right way, and it can be conducive to prey species and tigers as well. We are proposing the leasing of hunting blocks with our Russian colleagues. And again, hunting is really quite important over there. So we've set something up not unlike Ducks Unlimited, where you promote habitat for wild boar and red deer. It's habitat for tigers too, and a whole array of other species. And we think it can work economically. The Russians are certain that it can. And a spin-off of that, it creates opportunity for the cottage industries that thrived under the communist management of the forest, which borders were closed, they really cut the forest very gently. And this is products of the forest: berries, nuts, fruits, medicinal plants, ginseng, honey. Domestically very important to the average family, but it also enters into commerce in the Far East. And the Russians are enthusiastically accepting that. It's still Mother Russia. And the government owns all the land. There are no private holdings in those forests. There are no BLM grazing permits. There are no Forest Service grazing permits. There's none of those things that can make a problem more complex than it is. When this became apparent to the Russians that the regional politicians and authorities, they made a plea to Moscow, to the Supreme Court in Russia, to put a stop to this, which they did. The native Utigay were really quite upset when the plans were to cut the entire watershed in what we would call a reservation that the Russian government has set aside for those native peoples who still make their livelihood from the forest. And that got a lot of international attention, particularly in Europe. And some very powerful organizations really took up the cause, you might say. So that has been largely stopped. Those resources will be utilized. It's how they're utilized is the important thing. And this hunting block can function, in our view, much like Ducks Unlimited has, which has done wonderful things for wetlands, and all the attendant species goes with that. And the naysayers can say, well, they just want more ducks so they can shoot them. So be it, as long as they provide for all those other species, and as long as that everything is a win-win situation. In my profession, Aldo Leopold couldn't publish in our main wildlife journal because he didn't know statistics. Many of the leaders in the conservation movement couldn't publish, and this is a pet peeve of mine. I won't get going on it, but I really do think that we're narrowing our people, and to succeed, often get a job in this field, you have to publish. And to do that in our journals today, you have to prove, I use this with my students, prove 3 ways statistically that it's dark outside. These wonderful observational powers we have are not accepted. So yes, I think you're absolutely right, and the days of the old naturalist are passé. And yet the father of our profession, Aldo Leopold, those beautiful things he said wouldn't be published today in our journals.
What have you observed in the differences between American and Russian scientists?
To a person, to an individual, the Russian scientists are field people. They came up through the ranks as technicians and youngsters in the field. A supervisor of a region over there knows every creek, ridge, literally every tree in his region. And that's a contrast to our natural resource administrators. Many of them even grew up in a different part of the country. So they've literally come up through the ranks. They're all super outdoors people. They're all very good, the people that we deal with. There's individual variation, of course. That we would call them natural history scientists. We would call them naturalists. Just what we were talking about. They're not the specialized people that some in our scientific ranks are. So we've been really pleased. They weren't permitted to publish outside the Soviet Union, and yet they smuggled in material. They somehow gained access to publications from other countries. Most of it came through Europe to them. So they kept abreast, and I haven't been greeted in a scientific community anywhere in the world like I was there. They had their theories, they had their snow tracking studies, and some of them were right on track, but they were eager to use modern technology to either refute or confirm their findings. It's been one of those really rewarding experiences for all of us to work with them. We don't know how many, but there were literally thousands of them, perhaps tens of thousands. But they were just like wolves in North America, cougars in North America. They were systematically exterminated. The communists clamped down on the killing of tigers in the early 1950s. Prior to that, the military hunted them. You saw the pictures of these hired tiger hunters who were literally sent out there to just kill tigers. But the communists clamped down on that, and there were severe penalties for killing tigers. And so our Russian colleagues feel that the tigers remaining in the Sokotia-Lin Reserve, this reserve in which we're working, it's the Yosemite-sized reserve, really saved the Siberian tiger. And that gives rise to the genetic questions. But those numbers, when we began work over there, our Russian colleagues didn't know, but they felt there were probably 300 to 400 there. After the borders opened, and you saw from the graph of the home ranges, they go beyond the borders of this reserve. We probably lost half of them in just a span of a couple of years. That was in the early 90s, probably 95 was when things turned around. Since that time, that population has almost doubled. So they have tremendous reproductive capability if we just don't kill them.
Are you able to identify tigers by their coat? Individual tigers?
There are marks, not the whole coat, but there are marks above the tiger's each eye. You may have noticed that in some of these. That's an individual mark. That's a fingerprint. And it'd be a real unusual thing for two tigers to have two identical ones over either eye. They might have a V-shaped one over this eye, but this one might be different. So we photograph all the tigers that we capture, and the poachers know that we can identify those hides, those skins, and so that's been a deterrent in its own right. And just the fact that that there are marked tigers out there, and a tiger that a poacher might attempt to kill might be a marked one with severe penalties. It's deterred the poaching a great deal.